It is my great pleasure to introduce Aaron Clauset. He is will be a colleague, and is a colleague at Boulder here, and he has a very broad and multidisciplinary area of expertise. He is active participant in the network science, computer systems, computational biology, and computational social science communities. His work generally focuses on understanding mechanisms by which large-scale patterns emerge from collective actions of heterogeneous individuals. He came to the University of Colorado at Boulder from the Santa Fe Institute, where he was an Omni Dyer fellow. He completed his doctoral work in computer science at the University of New Mexico. He currently has many affiliations. Of course, is in the computer science department in Boulder, but he's also a core faculty at the Biofrontiers Institute, an affiliated faculty in the ecology and evolutionary biology department, applied mathematics, information science, electrical, computer, and energy engineering departments as well. Also, he's an external faculty at the Santa Fe Institute. He's a deputy editor for Science Advances, and he has received many awards, including the Provost Faculty Achievement Award at the University of Colorado here, and the Erdos Renier Prize in Network Science and the NSF Career Award. And with that, I want to welcome Aaron, and looking forward to your talk. Let's welcome him.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So this talk is a complementary one to the one that Professor Larimore gave you earlier today. In fact, the beginning of it will serve as a reminder of some of the aspects of that work that synergizes and sort of undergirds some of the other points we'll make today. So the title of this presentation is meant to be provocative, right? Little in academia makes sense except in the light of prestige. This is meant to echo a similar statement that was made about biology in the sense of evolution. But here the point is that in order to really understand the causes of epistemic or social inequalities, I think we really have to understand how prestige, which sort of is the currency of academia and science in general, drives and maintains them. And what I mean by epistemic inequalities is differences in the attention or impact of scholarship. Citation counts being sort of the most easily quantifiable measure of epistemic impact. And of course, there are huge disparities in terms of which things get cited and which things don't. Social inequalities has to do with who gets cited, who gets to be faculty, who gets the chance to make ideas that other people get to see. And so my pitch here is that prestige is sort of a first order variable for understanding these kinds of questions. So this talk will very briefly start off with the echo of Professor Larimore's presentation about how prestige shapes the composition of the scientific workforce. Then we'll spend most of the talk going through ideas about how prestige shapes which scientific ideas tend to spread and get attention, and then how prestige drives scientific productivity. Okay, let's dive right in. So prestige is a sense that we all sort of have an intuitive notion of what it is. If you've been in academia at all, you know that reputation and pedigree and prestige matter in some ways, and they matter in complicated ways. But here what we mean is prestige in the sense of Burris 2004, Burris was a sociologist, as a form of social capital. It's a way of providing resources inside the social dynamics of science overall. And we can actually infer a notion of prestige, a measure of prestige, by looking at who hires who graduates as faculty. So this is what Professor Larimore described, in which hiring is a kind of an endorsement, right? So if my department hires the graduate of another department as faculty, then my department is endorsing the training program of that department, saying like, yes, you guys did a great job at training this new PhD grad, and we want them to come and join our department. And so in that sense, it's a quality assessment. And we can write down these pairwise assessments as a network. So the faculty hiring becomes a network, and we can measure prestige as a network measure by looking at essentially centrality in this faculty hiring network. So you've seen the figure in the bottom left before. This is the actual flows of computer science faculty among 10 elite departments. The size of the arrow tells you the magnitude of the flow. And so you can see that there's a large amount of flow from, say, MIT to Carnegie Mellon, two very large computer science departments. And perplexingly, there's a very small amount of flow from, say, Harvard to MIT, a very small arrow. Perhaps there's a river or something in the way that prevents people from sort of moving from one side to the other. And so we take this network and we can infer a linear ranking out of it in terms of who hires whose graduates as faculty, so that most of the edges, say, go down the hierarchy and very few edges go up the hierarchy. And that allows us to, from this network of endorsements, extract a sort of data-driven notion of prestige. So this means that the prestige notion is independent of productivity, of impact, of citations, of US News and World Report type things or Times of Higher Education. These are more sort of subjective rankings, whereas here we're looking at the output of these departments, like the direct measure of endorsements as a function of the graduates that come out of those programs. So it's a different, more data-driven, more grounded sense in terms of what prestige really means. It's a notion of placement power, if you will. Okay, so I'm just going to refresh your memory with a figure that you saw earlier today. So this is the data from the Academic Analytics Research Center. So essentially all tenure track faculty in all fields. And if we look at the production of faculty by institution, what we find is essentially absolutely astounding inequalities, that there's sort of a universal 80-20 rule, that 80% of faculty are produced by only 20% of institutions. Now, this is just in the US, so we don't really know what it looks like outside the US, but you can imagine, if you have some experience in those systems, that perhaps it's not that different, that prestige really does drive who hires whose faculty as graduates. Okay, so the point that I want you to take away from this sort of mini summary of Professor Laramore's presentations is that there's this enormous systemic inequality in terms of who gets to be faculty. And faculty are special, as he said, because they're the ones who train the next generation of scientists. They're deeply involved in the development of new ideas, new discoveries, et cetera, and they have very long careers, typically 30 or 40 years. And so it's really important, if you want to understand the dynamics of science as a system, to understand the faculty themselves, because they make up a critical part of that evolution. So the faculty production itself has this sort of core periphery type structure. There's faculty that flow from the core, those 20% of institutions in the middle, out to the colonies. And that really is, I mean, it sounds sort of pejorative. I mean it in actually a literal sense, that the homeland, those core communities, are the ones who colonize the peripheral communities, in the sense that they produce most of the faculty, and the faculty then move out, and there's very little flow back into the core. And so this sets up prestige as a structural variable in academia, that field level prestige hierarchies are deep and stable. And it presents this idea that maybe a lot of the other inequalities, the disparities that we find in science, are actually derived from this one, that prestige is the underlying disparity variable that structures and drives many of the other things. So the basic sort of causal story that I want you to take away from this little mini summary is that prestige, which shapes and drives faculty production, creates this notion of hierarchy that we're all intimately familiar with, right? You can name, probably in the US, the institutions who are in that core, but you might struggle to name the institutions that are in the periphery, because we all attend to those ones, the homeland ones. If you poll the average department in a field, say my field of computer science, and you just look at where they got their PhDs, it's all the usual suspects, right? Like it's the elite universities. And that's true for every department, essentially, because of this 80-20 rule, that the elite departments really drive much of the system by training, by personnel. Okay, so now in the rest of the presentation, we want to explore some of the consequences of that. So scientific ideas, that's really the core of the science of science. We want to understand epistemology. Some ideas spread further than others, right? There's this sort of cute paper in Nature many years ago that looked at the top most cited papers, and the ones at the very top, have just gazillions of citations, and it's really truly astounding how far those ideas have spread in the scientific world. And the question is, why do some ideas spread further than others? And there are kind of three classes of explanations that we're going to consider. The first is that there are genuine differences in merit. Some ideas are just better than others, and that's probably true, right? There are papers out there that you can find, and you read them, and you're like, well, how the heck did this thing get published? Like, it doesn't teach me anything. And so, like maybe that one doesn't really deserve, it doesn't have enough quality to really go very far. And there are other papers that you read and you're like, wow, this is just amazing. It's like a bolt of lightning in my brain. This thing deserves the 10,000 citations or whatever that it has, right? So even us as scholars, we can tell that there are differences in the quality of ideas. And so that differences in merit, it's in there somewhere. But the question is, what else could be going on? Well, there could be non-meritocratic social processes. And these are things that have been very well studied for decades, in fact, but now that we have a lot more data about them, we have more insights about them. Things like the influence of fame or prestige or seniority or discrimination or the track record, the history, etc. And so these are biases in terms of who gets credit and who gets opportunities in terms of putting ideas out there. So these non-meritocratic social processes are distinct from differences in merit. And in some sense, the difficulty of doing good science as science is trying to tease out the differences between these different classes. But in this section of the talk, I want to talk about a third possibility, which is non-meritocratic structural factors, which is in particular the way prestige shapes the whole system as a result of the faculty hiring process. And here's the idea. Scientists carry ideas with them from their PhD training institution to their faculty institution. And so if they're exposed to a certain set of ideas, they see what the faculty are working on in their doctoral department, they're familiar with that information. They see what their colleagues are working on. And so when they move to another institution, they take that knowledge with them. And as a result of that sort of translocation of information, it changes who works on what ideas in what places. And so the differences in placement power that come from the prestige hierarchy drive epistemic inequalities. Okay, so this is a mechanism. It's an agenda setting theory, essentially, that biases who does the work in different places. Okay, so we're going to test this idea in two different ways. But first, I'm going to give you a vignette that sort of makes the point. Non-meritocratic structural factors are known, for instance, to have driven the spread of these things called Feynman diagrams. This is from particle physics. So Richard Feynman came up with these diagrams as a way of sort of organizing the different interactions of high energy particles. And he created them as a shortcut, as an accounting technique. And he taught them to a few people. And then those people ended up at the Princeton Institute for Advanced Study. And there are a bunch of these postdocs, and they all learned this technique from a few people. And then those postdocs went and got jobs at different places, and they modified the way that the Feynman diagrams were made. And so on the left-hand side, the little squiggly lines, that shows you an example of one of the original Feynman diagrams. And then these postdocs went to different places, to Chicago, to Harvard, to Berkeley, et cetera. And they modified the way that they use this idea. But that literally, you can trace in this part of the scientific history, the spread of this idea to the fact that those postdocs were all in the same place and learned the idea from one of the founders of it, okay? So this is a nice vignette that sort of makes the point, but now we want to do some real science, and we want to see if we can investigate this idea at scale, okay? So here's what we're going to do. We're going to try to test this idea that scientists carry ideas from their PhD to the faculty institution by looking at hiring events and publication topics. And we're going to test whether where an idea is being worked on can be explained by faculty placement and hence by social capital. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take our hiring network data. So we have a full time series, say, of computer science of who got hired where in different times, and we have their publication history. And so we can check to see whether or not, if a department is publishing papers on a given idea, if they were doing that prior to hiring somebody who works on that idea. And if that happens, then we say that the department did not adopt the idea because of hiring. But in the reverse situation, suppose the department has no history of publishing a paper on topic X, and then they hire somebody with a track record of publishing on X, and then the department has papers coming out on topic X. So that, we would say, is an event in which the department adopted the idea X as a result of hiring somebody who works on idea X. So that's a key event of importing the idea as a result of hiring somebody. So those are the two situations. You can import the idea from hiring, or you already have people who are working on it, in which case hiring a new person to work on it does not count as one of these importation events. And our goal is just to count the relative number of these two events for a subset of topics of choice. So what we're going to do is look at 5 topics total. And here I'm going to show you visualization of 3 topics in computer science, topic modeling, incremental computing, and deep learning. We chose these in part because they have keywords that make it easy to tell whether or not somebody publishes on this topic or a department publishes on this topic. So topic modeling, of course, is very cute. Here you can see the evolution in terms of people being hired. The purple dots are adoptions by hiring events, and the open gray circles are non-adoption by hiring events. So they already had people publishing in that area already. And what you see is that there is sort of a distinct spread, right? Like it's a few edges at first, and then a few more, and then a lot more. But you can also see that the counts of these numbers don't always show that most of the events are from hiring, right? That the gray open circles, like there's a lot of spread of ideas that happens outside of the hiring framework, but that's okay. We're not trying to claim that all spread of ideas is driven by faculty hiring, only that faculty hiring is a mechanism by which ideas spread through the scientific community. Here's what it looks like for incremental computing, and then deep learning is a total mess. And if any of you have been following the deep learning story, you're familiar with the fact that it's everywhere now, right? And it really got everywhere really fast. And so we'll talk about that more in a moment. So here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna count up for these 5 different topics, the fraction of observations, the fraction of events in which it was done by hiring versus not done by hiring. And then we're going to have to compare it to a null model. So here we constructed essentially a permutation test that allows us to maintain the diversity of topics, the specific hiring events, but otherwise randomizes people's history in terms of what they work on as a way of creating a null model that lets us say like, okay, are we seeing more adoption by hiring events than we expect just based on people working on random ideas? What we find is that for 4 of the 5 topics, there is a significant improvement, a significant gap in terms of these hiring events relative to what we would expect just by people working on random things, except for deep learning. And so in some sense, deep learning is the exception that makes the point, because deep learning spread in part because places like Google created these cheap tools that would allow anybody anywhere to start working on a deep learning topic. And so deep learning spread so fast, and in some sense could not have been driven by faculty hiring, that the timescales of these 2 processes was sufficiently separate. Deep learning spread really fast, faculty hiring is relatively slow, that deep learning spread through other mechanisms, through conferences, through the availability of free tools, through people reading the papers and saying, that's a great idea, I'm gonna start working on that now too. Whereas in the other ones, like quantum computing and mechanism design, incremental computing and topic modeling, these were not quite as hot an idea. And so we find that there was a significant role for faculty hiring in terms of driving the spread of those ideas. I see that there are some things in the chat I haven't been monitoring. I will hold that until later. Okay, so that's great. We find some empirical evidence that faculty hiring is a driver of the spread of ideas. And therefore, this hierarchy that we found through placement power is shaping who works on what where. But let's ask, like, what's the logical extreme of how far this could go? What if all of the spread was driven just by faculty hiring? So what this suggests is that the point of origin really might shape the spread of an idea. So we're going to use an independent cascade model as a way of modeling this directly. So we're going to take these empirical faculty hiring networks, and we're going to seed them with a simulation of a spread of an idea. So the independent cascade model is a classic model for spreading of ideas, in which a node is either active or not active. If it's active, then it gets 1 chance to seed its neighbors with the activation. And if it succeeds with some probability P, which is independent across its edges, then that node becomes active and the process repeats, okay? So we can look at how big these cascades get as a function of how high the transmission probability is. And what we're gonna do is we're going to vary the place in which the cascade starts as a function of prestige. So we're gonna seed the spread from a high prestige place, a middle prestige place, and a low prestige place, and ask how large do the cascades get? Is there a systemic advantage for an idea being born essentially at a higher prestige versus a lower prestige place? So then we're going to vary the transmissibility of the idea from a low transmissible idea to a high transmissible idea to investigate the trade-offs between quality of the idea in terms of spreading and where it gets born in terms of prestige. Okay, so here's what a meritocracy would look like in this situation. So the y-axis shows you the fraction of the system that ends up adopting this idea, and the x-axis shows you the prestige. So smaller numbers are higher ranked places. And so Stanford in computer science is the top CS department, and so its value is 1, okay? And then, so meritocracy would say that ideas spread proportional to their quality, and it doesn't matter where they're born, okay? So the purple line corresponds to transmissibility of 0.1, and so 0.1 of the system should adopt it on average if the network doesn't make any difference in terms of the spread, because spread is independent of the birthplace. It only depends on the quality of the idea. That's the meritocratic principle. What we find instead is that there's a huge dependence on where an idea is born. That if an idea is low transmissibility, so a low quality idea, but is born at a high prestige place, it still manages to spread pretty far. If the idea is really good, a high probability of transmission, it doesn't matter where it's born. It's going to percolate the system no matter what. So this implies that there's a trade-off between where an idea is born and how far it spreads in terms of the quality, that lower quality ideas will still spread if they're born at the right place. So this kind of suggests that there are likely good ideas out there that have not spread as far as they probably deserve because they were not born at high prestige places. Okay, so if we're looking for overlooked good ideas, they're probably things that have been worked on at mid-prestige places because those spread less well than the bad ideas from the best places. Okay? So we can, because this is a simulation model, we can actually extract out of this using some techniques from physics called a data collapse, a universal curve that shows us how the trade-off between probability of transmission and where something was born, how that gets traded off. So you can derive a universal function that tells you sort of what the expected return on spread is as a function of increasing the prestige of where an idea was born. And it's basically an exponential relationship, that prestige is an idea amplifier in the literal sense. Okay. So what we find is some evidence to support this idea that inequalities in epistemology reflect non-meritocratic structural factors, that scientists do carry ideas with them from their PhD institution to their faculty institution. They really are these like baggages, this baggage of ideas that moves around the system. And that the difference in placement power really drives some of this epistemic inequality as a result in which the research agendas of the high ranked places end up being spread throughout the rest of the system. Now, this could be a good thing, it could be a bad thing. I'm not necessarily making a value judgment about that entirely. For instance, if you have a really good idea and you want it to percolate the system, then you want the high-ranked institutions to seed it everywhere, and it'll spread like wildfire. On the other hand, it certainly is going to impede the spread of good ideas that are not located at those top places. Okay, so in addition to prestige driving changes in faculty production, which drives changes in placement, we also find that it drives changes in influence, right? The simulation study suggests that idea diffusion over hiring networks shows that prestige, this idea of social capital, is an exponential amplifier for attention to different ideas. So the faculty hiring network becomes a structural mechanism. It creates and maintains epistemic inequalities in terms of who works on what idea where. And this implies that your location in the prestige hierarchy really shapes how far your ideas can spread. And that's kind of demoralizing in some sense because we adhere to this tenet, this principle, this ideal of the meritocracy. And what we found through many different studies is that the meritocracy has structure to it, right? And that structure changes the way it behaves from what our ideal tells us it should be, okay? So it presents this interesting question, which is, can interventions increase fairness in the spread of scientific ideas? And I don't have an answer to that question. If you all have ideas, we can go over those in the Q&A, for instance. Okay, so now I want to turn to a second aspect in which the prestige can drive differences in epistemic markers, which is scientific discourse itself is dominated by these elite scientists and elite institutions. So what drives the differences in those productivities, right? We've seen that where an idea is born determines how far it spreads, but also there are differences in terms of the generation of the ideas, in which the elite institutions are generating far more ideas, far more contributions than the less elite institutions. So here, again, for computer science, my field, on the y-axis on the left, we have the median publications for early career researchers for the first 10 years after being hired as faculty. And that black line shows you there's a factor of almost 3 in terms of productivity differences between the elite researchers and the most non-elite researchers. Citations also vary quite a bit in terms of how much citation attention these different ideas are getting. So there's huge inequalities, not just in terms of how far the ideas spread, but also in terms of how many ideas are being generated. So we'd also like to try to understand whether or not prestige is having a role in driving that too, and if so, how is it doing it? Okay, but there's a problem here, which is an endogeneity, which is that the elite scientists, as we've argued, are mostly trained at prestigious departments, and they mostly work there too. And so this sets up this notion of an endogenous cumulative advantage, right? Past achievements correlate with and predict future achievements, but which comes first, right? The chicken or the egg in that sense. So there are 2 possible easy explanations for this. One is that your productivity is driven by where you trained, right? So your pedigree, your training really drives how much you produce. And so it's really about skill or talent or training or mentorship. And then the faculty hiring market sorts these individuals by their natural or previously acquired characteristics, which correlates with outcomes. And therefore, that's why you see this big disparity in terms of outcomes, in terms of publications. So the most productive scientists, they have elite pedigree from Stanford, from Caltech, Harvard, Penn, et cetera. So essentially where you trained is what causes your future productivity or prominence. But a second possibility is that it's where you work. So environmental factors or resources or the people you work with, that's what drives your productivity. So beyond a basic training in sort of being a researcher, scientific output is much more driven by the local environment. So for instance, if you move from a resource poor environment to a resource rich environment, we would expect to see an increase in your productivity. There was a wonderful paper by Allison and Long in 1990 that had a very small sample size that actually showed some evidence that this was true. Now, they didn't have enough causal controls to really make it compelling. It was just a correlational study that scientists who do move in their mid-career tend to be more productive after they move. But it doesn't account for the selection effect in the sense of the scientists who are able to move in the mid-career might be the ones who have a greater possibility of being productive. Okay, so this second idea is the idea that where you work causes your future productivity. So these are the two possibilities, where you train or where you work. But isolating these environmental effects is really hard because of feedbacks and endogeneities. You can't run randomized experiments. I would love to take control of the faculty hiring market for a year and allocate people randomly into faculty jobs. I'm pretty sure no IRB would agree to that, and I get no volunteers to go in that as well. So we only get to observe one set of outcomes. So our solution here is going to be to use those natural outcomes as a quasi-natural experiment and use causal inference techniques in order to try to tease out whether there's really an effect for one versus the other of these ideas. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to take scientists, early career researchers, we're going to match them on their training environment. So we're controlling for the pedigree here. And we're going to match them on a bunch of different variables in terms of pre-faculty hiring productivity, matching on gender, matching on year of placement to control for non-stationarities. We're going to match on postdoctoral training, et cetera. So we're going to try to create essentially these twins, people who look like they're the same. And then we're going to ask, okay, conditional on one moving to a more prestigious institution for the faculty job and one moving to a less prestigious institution for the faculty job, what's the difference in terms of their publications and citations after the treatment effect, which is being hired in these two different places, okay? So first we need to establish that from the perspective of the observable variables that we have established that these two people are twins, we've done the matching well. And what we find is that yes, indeed, we have matched appropriately, that the differences in publications prior to the treatment event being hired is zero, essentially, okay? And then we can look at what happens afterwards. And what we find is that the researcher who goes to the more prestigious institution has greater productivity and greater prominence measured in terms of publication counts and citations. And so similar training but different placement drives different productivities and prominences, okay? So this suggests that it's not your pedigree that determines your future productivity and prominence. It's in fact where you place, where you work, okay? So conditioned on holding a faculty position, the more elite training doesn't drive greater scholarly impact relative to peers in similar faculty positions. So it's the work environment, not the training, that appears to drive impact. Now, there are a few other possibilities that we consider. We consider selection effects downstream. We consider adaptation effects. Maybe you change your productivity to adapt to the department you're in, et cetera. And we don't find much evidence for these kinds of things, not in the sense of explaining this large disparity, a factor of 3 productivity differences between the most and the least elite. Okay, so the evidence for environment driving this seems pretty strong. Okay, so the causal story here is doctoral prestige drives faculty location, and there's a series of papers that seem to support that argument. And then faculty location is what drives scholarly impact. But now there's a question of mechanism. Like how is it exactly that higher prestige places manage to juice the productivity of their researchers so much more so than the less prestigious places? And our hypothesis was, it's just people, right? It's just labor. That prestige drives or facilitates larger research groups, and that's where the productivity comes from people having lots of people in their research group, and those are the ones that are producing the research. Okay, so here I'm just going to show you a little bit of evidence supporting that argument. So we're going to link data for 80,000 regular faculty using Web of Science as our background for the productivity. And we're going to decompose the total productivity, so all the papers associated with a person's name, into two types. One type is group productivity. So these are papers that you co-author with non-faculty, same institution individuals, okay? Because the academic analytics data set gives us a set of all faculty, we can establish whether a person who's a co-author with you is another professor at your university or not. And if they're at your same institution, same department, but not a professor, then we're going to categorize them as a member of your research group. So they could be a graduate student or a postdoc or a staff scientist, et cetera. Okay? And we're going to, so the total productivity is group productivity, papers co-authored with members of your group, and then individual productivity, which is papers who are not co-authored with members of your group. So usually these are papers that you write yourself, maybe it's a book or a monograph or a single author paper, or it could be something that you pursue outside of your research group. So it does include collaborations, but just not collaborations with members of your research group. So by decomposing this in these two sets, we're going to try to tease out whether or not most of the differences in productivity disparities comes from the group differences as opposed to individual. So first, what we find is that, sorry, I apologize, I flipped the meaning of prestige now. So this is now in the other direction. So most prestigious is 10, least prestigious is 1. Sorry for that. So we see, first of all, that faculty really are more productive across these different fields. 78,000 regular faculty is not just computer science now. It's in fact covering about 25 different fields. So faculty really do become almost twice as productive as you go up the prestige hierarchy. But what's interesting is that if you look at those group members, as a function of prestige, they are not getting more productive. Okay, so already we're seeing evidence for this labor hypothesis that the members of the group are just as productive at the most elite institutions as the least elite institutions. So the natural hypothesis is if you want to increase total productivity, you have to add more individual group members in order to do so. And what we find when we decompose these 25 fields into those with norms around collaboration, so running a research group versus norms that are not around running a research group, so like sociology and political science, and so on. Like, these are fields that don't have established norms the same way that computer science, physics, and chemistry does. So we can use this variable in terms of norms as a way of getting a sense of, is it really the collaboration? Is it the research group that's driving this? What we find is that the individual productivity in these two different classes of fields is basically the same as a function of prestige. You see a small increase, but most of the increase comes from the group productivity. Okay, so most productivity comes from the groups, and that's the upper line that you see there. Whereas for the fields that don't have the norm around running a research group, you don't see any increase really in the productivity from the group aspect. Okay, so these PIs are not running large groups. They're not collaborating with students to publish papers. Whereas the people who are in the fields with collaboration norms, like physics, computer science, and chemistry, for instance, they are running, their group productivity is going up, even though the group members are not becoming more predictive. So the implication is it's the size of the group, right? You want to write more papers, you just hire more people, and then each one of them writes a paper for you. And so your productivity as the PI is going up. Okay, so let's wrap up. What have we learned here? Well, a tenet of meritocracy is that productivity and prominence is driven by individual skill and training, and our entire reward system is based on the idea of individual credit. But what we showed is that this assumption is false, in fact, that environmental prestige drives productivity and prominence, and it does it in a labor sense. The mechanism is just more people. So it's not pedigree or selective hiring or selective retention or adaptation to department norms that drives differences in productivity and prominence. It's really where you work. So these environmental mechanisms are what cause these differences, and that sets up a cumulative advantage over time, right? The most elite researchers have large research groups, they write the most papers, and so their track records look amazing. And so then they get more money, they can hire more people, write more papers, et cetera. So that endogenous cumulative advantage is an engine driven by these environmental mechanisms, okay? But it also implies that your individual productivity and prominence is non-intrinsic to you. It means that it cannot be separated from your place in the academic system. So where you work really sets up to a first approximation what your reputation is going to be like on average. Okay? So let's step back and take a survey of what we've learned here. The pitch was nothing makes sense in academia except in the light of prestige. I hope I've convinced you, at least from these two aspects, that this is true, with a little bit of reference to Professor Laramore's work as well, that the epistemic inequalities are really driven in part by non-meritocratic structural factors, and prestige is the first and most important one. So this implies that models of scientific productivity that ignore these environmental variables are incomplete, right? If our goal in the science of science is to understand, how to predict discovery and how to make it more likely and how to make it more inclusive, we can't do that unless we account for these environmental differences in terms of how much and what kinds of ideas different scientists are able to contribute. And so analyses that don't account for these effects are implicitly confounded. They're trying to compare apples to apples, but instead they're comparing apples to nectarines, right? And they're saying that they're all apples instead. So prestige drives faculty production. It drives faculty placement, which shapes the spread of scientific ideas. It drives group sizes, which shapes faculty productivity. And there's probably many other things that prestige is going to influence as well. Okay. So the work that I covered today was the subject of about 5 different papers and a whole host of fantastic people, including Professor Larimore. And I think I will wrap up now and take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Aaron. Sovereign presentation. So please, if you have questions, unmute yourself, ideally with camera, and ask away. I know that you have many questions given by the chat's activity.
I apologize for not taking questions as we were going along.
No problem.
We have some time.
Yeah, maybe I can go first in that case. I think I was the one writing the most. Yeah, thank you for the presentation. It was really nice. I was just wondering, so in one of your figures, there is a drop in the 3rd year after placement and productivity of the matched authors.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering what if this is just some data issues, what kind of, why is there a drop just before the 4th year?
So this was in the last section where we're trying to dig into how the group productivity drives overall total productivity. And we have not investigated that particular data point to try to understand whether it's an artifact. My gut feeling is that it's a statistical fluctuation because the trend line is very sort of clear and there's a little bit of movement around it. So I don't have a clear explanation for what's going on there, but my guess is that there's nothing. My hope and guess is that there's nothing sort of causal going on there. Now, in other work, what we have found is that in the first couple of years after faculty start their jobs, there's usually a lower productivity than you'd expect relative to what you see later on. So usually you see, on average, faculty productivity goes up in the first 6 years, and then it sort of peaks around year 5 or 6, and then it comes down slightly and sort of stabilizes. Now, that's the canonical trajectory and the average across the whole population. There's a huge amount of variation in terms of productivity trajectories across a career. But what we do find is that those first couple of years as being faculty, there is a systematic drop in productivity, which kind of makes sense. Like, you're starting a new job, you're trying to learn how to teach and do service and build a research group and write grant proposals. And it's just a fact of the matter that those 2 years are really stressful. And so often you write a little bit fewer papers. Then once things sort of pick up, you figure out how to balance all these different demands, productivity goes up again. So it may be that that drop is related to some of those effects, but it would require a separate study to figure it out.
Okay, thanks. I was just wondering, I have 2 more questions.
Okay.
One is what type of researchers are considered faculty? I think you mentioned that these were mainly PIs. Is that correct?
Yeah, so academic analytics tracks the tenured and tenure track faculty primarily. They have data on other categories of faculty, but it's much more inconsistent, in part because universities are inconsistent in how well they report that data themselves. So when I said faculty in all of my presentations, my presentation today, I meant tenured and tenure track faculty exclusively. So it does mean that we don't know what these effects might be like for, say, research faculty who are on soft money, or people who are teaching faculty whose primary responsibility is teaching, but who may still be doing some research on the side, or contingent faculty. We don't have any notion of what's going on with them from the data that we have.
Okay, thanks. And you also showed that there was some group productivity dynamics that were different. You mentioned that in some fields, the group productivity was going up. And one example was physics. And I was just wondering if these differences can be explained by the collaborative culture or nature of these fields. For instance, in high energy physics, you have like hyper authorship, and that can bring the overall group productivity up? That's just an example.
That's certainly true that in some subfields, there are these enormous collaborations with dozens, hundreds, thousands of researchers or co-authors on the papers. And that represents a very tiny fraction of all the papers that were in our data set. So the trend in terms of group productivity is really looking at, say, the median as opposed to looking at the high end of these things. I have to check with Sam Zhang, who did the analysis. If I recall correctly, we actually excluded papers that had more than 100 authors from any of the analyses because they have this sort of biasing effect on averages, not necessarily on medians. And so what we find is that that effect in terms of group productivity going up with prestige is not driven by increases in co-authorship numbers. It's much more driven by the number of researchers in the group itself.
Okay, that's all from my side. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I would like to also ask some questions. I mean, maybe one or two. One is about the good or bad ideas that you just talked about. Could you please explain us what is the meaning of good or bad idea about, and also the model that you just developed? What was the meaning?
Sure. So that model is a toy model in which the notion of the quality of an idea is tied directly to and parameterized by the transmission probability inside the model. So the idea is this independent cascade model in which nodes have two states. They're either active or inactive. And if a node becomes active, it tries to activate each of its neighbors. And because the activations are independent cascade, with probability P, that's the quality of the idea, that's the transmissibility of the idea. With probability P, the active node activates one of its neighbors. And the idea in the model is that that node has started working on some topic and it tries to spread that topic to each of its neighbors. And so it flips a coin. With probability P, its neighbor becomes active and starts working on that topic too. So the notion of good idea and bad idea inside the model is parameterized explicitly by this transmission probability. Now, we don't have any way of assessing good or badness of ideas in empirical data at this point.
So I would like to ask Marcia's questions as well as it was mine. The bad ideas are going to spread faster than the good idea. Is that right? Similar to the social information and that things, yeah?
Well, only it's all conditioned on where the idea is seated. So let's say I choose a probability of transmission at 0.1. So this is the lower end of the scale in terms of quality. If I see that idea spread at Stanford University in computer science, which has 120 faculty as alumni at other places, its alumni network is so large that a fraction 1/10 of those edges will activate and spread that idea to the neighbors. And so the spread of that low quality idea from a high prestige place is going to be non-trivial as a result of where it's born in the network. Whereas if I take that same idea and I seed it at a low ranked university in computer science, like say Montana State University that has one alumnus somewhere, then only 1/10 of the time will that edge actually transmit that idea. Now contrast that with a high quality idea, say 0.9 transmissibility. Well, there, even at Montana State University, it's likely that one edge is going to transmit it. And then wherever that edge points, those edges are likely to transmit it. And so the high quality ideas will spread throughout the network no matter what, no matter where they are seated. Whereas the low quality ideas will spread much further if they are seated at the high ranked places because they have higher degree, right? They're more central in the network. And so you get a larger cascade centered at that location.
So my last question, how we can measure, the scientists are how much conservative to bring new ideas to their own universities. Means I think about, University of Boulder, it has, many ideas in it, but they are going to bring new ideas. Since one of the, persons just told in the chat that people, the professors in the university, they are going to try to find new members. So how much they are conservative to bring new ideas to their own university? Is there any measure?
That's not something that we have worked on ourselves. And I think it's a really interesting question because in popular discourse, we often talk about academia as being inherently conservative, right? Like resistance to new ideas is sort of implicit in the system. And so trying to figure out a way to quantify that conservativeness in terms of the spread of ideas, I think is a really interesting direction for future work. We don't have anything to say quantitative about that, but I do think that would be a nice direction to go if you all have ideas.
Okay. Oh, if you want to ask a question, Osgur, go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Yeah. Just can we interpret your results as the inequality in science is systemic and determined by the factors the researchers cannot change? Thanks.
I think it's very complicated, right? It's a social system, it has structure. And I think what many of the bibliometric studies that, have been incredibly interesting over the past 20 years, once we sort of got access to these really big databases. I mean, bibliometrics goes back to Garfield, and many of the ideas from Price and Garfield and so on, they still resonate, but they didn't have the data that we have today. So the bibliometric studies are very interesting, but they're incomplete because most of them don't grapple with the structure of the scientific system, which really shapes how ideas are spread. And the degree of stochasticity in the system is so large. So in this other paper we wrote some years ago about faculty productivity, what we found is that there's enormous variability from year to year. And so I would be reluctant to say that anything is deterministic, but rather that prestige is this biasing variable. It's a structure inside the system that really pushes trajectories in one direction or the other as a result of like determining them. You can be an unsuccessful researcher at an elite place with lots of resources. And if you are, maybe you should be embarrassed that you're taking the spot of somebody who maybe could use the resources better. I think that the resource difference is kind of, they should change the way we evaluate things by changing our expectations. That if you're a researcher at an elite place like MIT, which is central in the network, massive amounts of resources, high quality, everything, like we should expect great things from you. And so all of our evaluations of metrics should adjust based on what prestige tells us they should rise or fall as.
Okay, so if I may use my organizer privilege, I would like to ask maybe to speculate, if you can speculate a little bit, Aaron, and given also Dan's presentations, like it seems all very depressing. So I'm wondering if you have like if you think there is something, what are your thoughts about science itself? Do you think there is something of how science works? I mean, I would think that other domains of human endeavor are similar. They just have biases, and maybe we're using prestige as it's like a very good heuristic that we use to make decisions instead of spending the time to read very carefully papers and things like that. Do you think there is something special about science that we should correct? And
I think in many parts of human endeavors, there's less of a belief in the meritocracy. It's there, but in science, we really care about the quality of the ideas. Like that's the sort of fundamental thing we want. We want discoveries that are helpful to society, that improve the quality of life for people, that deepen our understanding of the universe and of human behavior. These are all very positive things. And I think that we can learn something about how science works by studying other human social systems, but we can also learn something about them by studying science. In some sense, academics were into all the things that people do on Twitter well before there was Twitter. We like to trash talk each other by writing comments about papers and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that there's definitely synergy that you could have by looking at these two different human social systems, but science is different because it's about discovery. And we want science to be this institution that is inclusive for all people and has sort of an ideal of meritocracy. And I think the work that is being done right now in terms of identifying and quantifying the biases in the system is helpful because it's showing us where we are not meeting our ideals, okay? And if we can get down to the mechanisms of understanding why is it that there's a disparity here? I don't think it's enough just to measure the fact that there are citation differences between men and women. We want to understand why there are differences in those citation practices so that we can address them if they are systemic biases or cultural biases or things like that. And so getting to the idea of being able to do a counterfactual of an intervention of saying, okay, this is a bias, a disparity that's holding back science in some way. How can we address it by changing policy? That's what I think the science of science has a huge potential for realizing. And this work that we're doing in terms of sort of measuring the different aspects of bias is useful because it helps us move in that direction, helps us realize that science is not as perfect a system as many of us sort of grew up being taught that it was. And those imperfections are things that can be changed because it's a social system. So I view this work as in a positive light, as sort of part of a long game of trying to make science more inclusive and more productive.